Good morning, everyone, all doctors, friends, colleagues, seniors who have joined us today for our third session, I should say, on the web series on COVID, which has been organized by our group of chest physicians from Mumbai. We call ourselves the Pulmonics. We have with us Dr. Samir Garde, who is a part of Pulmonics. I'll introduce each one. But today we have eminent chest physician with us, Dr. Zarir Udwadia, a name to reckon with, and I don't really need to introduce him. And he's an active member of the Maharashtra Task Force, senior pulmonologist at the PD Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. And we also have with us Dr. Rahul Pandit, who is the Director of Critical Care at Fortis Hospital and also a member of the Maharashtra Task Force. He has been with us for one of the web series on COVID earlier. Today, with the pandemic, we are facing a lot of issues related to the pharmacotherapy. And we have been bombarded on WhatsApps, on Facebooks, on the media about the steroid usage, about the use of tocilizumab, remdesivir, and so on and so forth. Some are correct, some are wrong. So we are trying this particular event to clear some of the controversies in the pharmacotherapy of COVID-19 in the presence of these eminent guests today. And we also have on our panel, myself, of course, but Dr. Kumar Doshi is a co-moderator. He's a leading pulmonologist from Ghatkopar and the head of pulmonology at the Asian Institute of Oncology. Dr. Samir Garde is with us. He's the head of pulmonology at Global Hospital Parel. Dr. Mehul Thakkar, he's a pulmonologist from Thane and running a hospital, Medansh Hospital at Thane. And Dr. Vikas Oswal, who is a pulmonologist in the central hub of Mumbai, that is the Chembur Govandi area, which we know has been always the hotspot of COVID-19. So with that background, I'm just going ahead with the topic of today. And without further delay, I would first have some opening remarks or some talk by our colleague and a very dear friend, Dr. Zarir Udwadia. Thank you, Zarir, for having agreed to be with us for this small talk and small session. A lot of people are eager to hear from you. Just a few remarks before we actually go on to steroids and tocilizumab. But your thoughts on remdesivir with what is happening today, I think your words will make a lot of difference. Please.
Thanks, Salil. Thanks for asking me. And it's a pleasure to meet colleagues and friends here and keep up the good work that all of you are doing. A few comments on remdesivir. What can I say? We know that it's the one antiviral drug that is known to be effective against SARS-CoV-2. But we've got very contrasting data from two major RCTs. Now, I always tell my colleagues, follow the data, right? But here we have conflicting data. So let's look at the two studies, one of which we were directly involved with. Hinduja was part of Solidarity. Act 1, the other study, of course, was a US and Europe-based study. So we in Solidarity showed that remdesivir had absolutely no impact on a host of parameters, including that golden one, of course, which was mortality. Act 1 showed that while it did not affect mortality, the drug did considerably reduce hospital stay. Now, in these desperate times, even reducing hospital stay by 4 or 5 days is a luxury all of us would gladly take. I'm always asked, would you take remdesivir if you were hospitalized? And the answer is, of course I would, because it's the one antiviral drug that's known to be effective. When would I take it? Like any drug, antibacterial or antiviral, I take it early, if possible. But then I'm asked, suppose you were admitted 7 days after, first 7 days at home like most of us are, and you go in on day 8 or 9 unwell, would you opt for remdesivir? Well, the honest answer is yes. It's easy to say use the antiviral early, use it in the first few days, the first 7 days. But what about if you're admitted very unwell with fever and bilateral shadows on day 7? Would you deny your patient the drug? So although we were part of Solidarity, my bias is that because we don't have anything better, we don't have anything else except for very good ICU and supportive care, and Rahul is the expert there. Of course, I would want it given even to me, even at that stage, hoping that it would have some impact. But let's compare the two studies so you put them in perspective. Solidarity was 11,000 participants strong. It was truly a global study. And I'm really proud to be part of that study in a small way. We had 4 or 5 recruited cases, but it was a great learning experience. Act 1 was 1,062 patients, and it was industry sponsored. So WHO versus Gilead, the company, and you always look with suspicion at a study which is industry sponsored. No placebo arm in the Solidarity, and there was a placebo arm in the Act 1 study. And the data I've discussed with you, Solidarity was weaker study design, larger sample size, but real world setting. As patients were coming in, even a small center could recruit them. Act 1 was stronger design, smaller sample size, much more tightly supervised, and industry sponsored. So you have to take your pick really. But till we get anything better in terms of antiviral agents, maybe antiviral combinations will be the way to go in the future. Right now, remdesivir is all we have. It's reasonably safe in my experience, even in this critically ill group of patients. And I guess we would use it, but don't despair if you can't get it. And that looks like the real world situation again. Soon we will be running out of this drug. It's not the end of the world. Tell your patients that. And you have to carry on with good supportive care, which remains the only thing which is the gold standard. So sorry for being a bit long, but those are my thoughts on this.
In fact, I would, Zari, just for the benefit of all those who are listening to us and actively involved, if you could just say the opposite, which particular scenarios you just wouldn't use remdesivir?
Well, someone who's not sick enough to deserve it in the first place, someone who's not even requiring oxygen, you certainly wouldn't give it.
That's important.
Yeah, but again, our Indians are so ingenious at breaking the rules. We will get into hospital to get remdesivir, which is sadly contrasting.
One is not so sick patients, so they're classified as one who is not on oxygen.
Yeah.
And what are the groups of the sick patients who don't deserve remdesivir? Say coming after day 10, day 11, day 12. What is that?
I don't know. I get upset with colleagues who use it at 2 weeks, for example, when a patient comes in. But what do? There is pressure from the doctors, from the family.
Yes.
You're not using remdesivir. Maybe it won't work. But I feel I don't think there is anything. It's not ideal science, but maybe it's all we have, as I said.
So this is all we wanted to actually get it out of you from the point of view of remdesivir. That
ideally, of course, use early, like we all know. But sometimes the situation is such that average patients are coming in now on day 7 or day 10.
Absolutely.
Not having used it and worsening. So would you deny them this drug?
In a very mild case who just doesn't need
oxygen. Of course not. They need no treatment.
That is the most important thing. Yeah.
Such patients need no treatment at home. Just monitoring.
This is all we wanted to bring about on remdesivir, and now we go on to the more contentious drugs of steroids, which we all know are the wonder drugs, but more often double-edged swords.
One more thing, yeah. So that's absolutely a very valid point. I think everyone should please remember that remdesivir has its own role, no doubt. But the timing of remdesivir is very important, and the clinical status of the patient is also equally important. And third thing important is the conviction which the treating clinician has, because many people give in because of lack of conviction, and many people give in because they themselves are not confident of what to do when the patient lands up in front of them. So these three aspects together drive the prescriptions for remdesivir.
And let's spell it out, Salil. Mild hospitalized patients also are not candidates for this drug. Absolutely. We should be reserving them for the more sick.
More sick. Yeah.
So with that, let's take one more opening remark from Rahul. Since you are also dealing with a lot of these cases, you have been a part of the task force. So any specific one or two pointers, because we got loads of questions already in my question bank, but just one or two remarks so that we can set the ball rolling.
Look, Zarir has said it all. The only other group of patients I would not use it if they have come in with multi-organ dysfunction after day 10, day 11. I think you probably are not going to benefit at all, because that problem is not COVID-19 related. This problem is probably secondary infection related when they actually go into multi-organ dysfunction. So that's the only remark I would like to say at this point. Everything else has been covered well by Zarir and everyone.
Absolutely. So Kumar, I think you can put up your clinical scenario.
Zarir, now let's get on to the more contentious drugs, and that is steroids. We know how important role does steroids play in the treatment of COVID, especially after the recovery trial really helped us a lot to treat. But the commonplace scenario which comes to a treating physician on the primary care physician, or even a physician in a hospital, the patients are not so sick, but that famous CT score comes into picture, that the CT severity score is 10, patient is having fever, but no breathlessness whatsoever. Does such a patient is a candidate for steroids, and if at all he is, how long would you give him steroids in such a scenario? Fever, no hypoxia, and a visual CT scan severity score of roughly about 8 to 10, mild to moderate.
So this is one reason why I feel strongly that CT scans should not be asked for. So again, I keep thinking about what some of my colleagues on this panel have actually had the misfortune of having COVID. I think it's a fate which all of us it can befall any of us. So again, I keep thinking of these scenarios in my mind. When would you ask for a CT scan on yourself, Zareen? And my answer is I wouldn't ask for a CT scan unless I was hypoxic. I don't want to know whether it's 5 or 10 will not make a difference, will not influence treatment decisions. You follow? Yes, we have this wonderful drug, which when given at the right time, steroids, cheap and easy to get, we'll never run out of steroids, hopefully, even in this country, can be a life changer. Yeah, but we know that steroids given too early will interfere with viral clearance. We know that they actually worked badly in H1N1, for example, which is another viral infection. So not based on lots of ground glass shadowing on a CT scan, which believe me, almost any patient with COVID would have. It's just a question of when you time that CT scan. Do it on day 2 and CT score will be 0. Do it on day 4, it will be 10. And we all have patients who go through a sequence of 4 CT scans in 2 weeks. That's tragic. I was on the CROI conference some time ago, and my colleagues on the panel were amazed that we would even ask for a CT scan in an outpatient setting. They said there would be no indication. These are colleagues in Europe and America who said they would just never do it or ask for it. And, they have the luxury of...
so in such a case where even if the CT score is 10, but no hypoxia, febrile, steroids is not an indication.
Yeah, but now coming to your very important question of if the fever persists, fever beyond day 7 or day 10 is always worrying. Always worrying. What I have started using recently is colchicine. And Rahul reviewed a very good paper. Rahul, it was you, I think, wasn't it, who reviewed that paper? And I went back to it, which is 4,000 patients plus, a real good sample size, and basically want an anti-inflammatory agent and one which does not allow viral replication to thrive at the same time, which steroids can theoretically do. So colchicine is something in between your paracetamol and your steroids. Yeah, and it's something that's worth considering if fever is just the main consideration.
Fever is not.
So I started using that in a big initial loading dose as the study used on first day, and then maybe even 1 BID or TID. Yeah. And that's something to consider because it's backed by some science.
Yeah.
But to be honest, let me be honest again, sometimes I have yielded to pressure and like all of us really. And when fever is persisting day 10 or 11 and the CT scan says, look, now it's scored 10, but I'm not hypoxic, I have been forced to use a small dose just to suppress that fever. So that is not what the drug was designed for.
And it
was designed for hypoxic patients. And in fact, non-hypoxic patients did worse. Let's be clear about the results of the
recovery data. The non-hypoxic patient, the mortality was higher. Now just go a step further, Zarir, and the patient is hypoxic and we know the dose of steroids to be given. It's 6 milligrams Dexa or equivalent dose of MPS. Quite often, however, in many institutions, we see 120 milligrams of methylprednisolone, 240 milligrams, even pulse methylprednisolone. What can be the dangers of such high doses of steroids in your moderate COVID?
What I and my colleagues are seeing all the time, severe immunosuppression, the problems with sepsis, which Rahul referred to in the 3rd week of the illness being magnified, and more specifically, the onset of, I'd seen mucormycosis rarely in my 30 years as a chest physician like all of us. But when you see 4 or 5 in a row in a few weeks' time, you know something is really going wrong. And that must be the effects of steroid and possibly tocilizumab. So it immunosuppresses these patients greatly.
So,
and try, one second, sorry, Kumar. Try and at least avoid the huge pulse doses that seem to be thrown around in such a cavalier fashion, and stick to what you said. 6 milligrams of Dexa equals 200 milligrams of hydrocortisone equals 80 milligrams of methylprednisolone equals 40 milligrams of prednisolone. So roughly stick to doses in that ballpark.
So as Zarir has rightly pointed out, what I wanted to get it out from him was no steroids in a non-hypoxic patient. please stick to the prescribed dosages in a moderate or a hypoxic patient. And for God's sake, don't pulse anyone. It's more dangerous than beneficial.
And certainly don't start in the first few days at home, because your own immune system has such a vital role at that stage in clearing the virus.
Yeah.
So ideally in the second week. This is a drug which should be started a little later, unlike remdesivir.
Yeah, because the viral clearance gets delayed if you put it in the first week. So Rahul, let's get on from here. From a patient who's come to you, you are into critical care. More often than not, patients are always going to be hypoxic, brought into your critical care. What would be the pointers, clinical or biomarkers wise, to start them or tocilizumab, if at all you choose to do so? Would IL-6 be the holy grail of putting someone on tocilizumab? Is it decision clinical driven? Is there any place in the first place for tocilizumab at this point in time in the treatment of COVID?
Absolutely correct. I think very, very pertinent question. The problem with tocilizumab is that I have actually not used it since September last year. So I'll be very honest with you to begin with. However, it does find a role on the national guidelines, the ICMR guidelines, which were put out a few days ago. And there are 5 things. I'm just going to go to that guideline and read out the 5 things which they say all have to be present. You can't have just one present and the other not present. Let me just bring that up. So what it says is, if you're going to consider tocilizumab off-label use, all of the below criteria have to be met. Presence of a severe disease, preferably within 24 to 48 hours of onset of symptom and severity of disease or ICU admission. Significant rise in inflammatory markers, CRP and or IL-6, not improving despite use of steroids, no active bacterial, fungal or tubercular infection. So all of these above have to be present. It's not one or the two of the above. So if I was to put it in a blunt way, I think by using tocilizumab, you have to be very, very precise in the timing at which you're going to use. So if you can use it within the first 24 hours of the worsening, then it probably may have some benefit. Once your pneumonia is set in, once you've actually got organized pneumonia, no amount of tocilizumab is going to be a substitute for good intensive care or ventilation or prone ventilation or HFNC. So please, what is happening right now is people are using these drugs as a substitute for good care. They don't want to intubate. They don't want to put them on high flow nasal. I'm sorry, I'm a bit blunt and honest about it. And they keep on using one dose, and then one dose is as if it's not enough, second dose. And then you have these newer markers which bevacizumab, infliximab, pegylated interferon, baricitinib, all of them are there in a line. And I would like to use that Marathi saying which I say, Adarapeksha aushad bhayankar dhale. So then we will be coming to the complications of these random use of these drugs and irrational use of steroids, which have caused a tsunami of mucormycosis. I'm sure all of you in the hospitals are seeing that. I am getting one case in my hospital. There are at least 200 hospitals in Mumbai, so there must be 200 cases. One of the district collectors called me up yesterday and said that he's worried because in a week's time, in a small district in Maharashtra, there were 35 cases which have come to his notice. So I think we have to be very, very careful before what we actually use. Now, coming up to the evidence, up until now, the evidence for tocilizumab was actually not present. All the trials done were showing a negative outcome. However, we just had a recovery data published 2 days ago, which I've just sent it to you, Kumar, on your WhatsApp a minute ago. I found it on my WhatsApp, on my phone, and I could forward it to you, which actually is a positive result for a change that actually talks about a positive result in favor of tocilizumab, which is talking about improvement in the mortality as well as improvement in the end point, which was actually mechanical ventilation. However, again, their timing has to be very, very important and precise. Unlike the Western world, people are coming to us in tertiary care units actually having received these doses much before, even before they probably needed it, or way before after they were actually not going to be useful for them. So tocilizumab is not something which I use. I would rather prefer to intubate them or to put them on a good NIV or HFNC, prone them and give them good intensive care. That doesn't mean that I am washing my hands off tocilizumab at all, but I have not had a good opportunity to actually say that this would be the right time to give it.
So most importantly, in a large tertiary care like Fortis, which you are having since September, you haven't really had a nice opportunity to use this molecule effectively. And till date, whatever evidence we had was absolutely against it. In fact, to me, I've always felt that tocilizumab has probably contributed to the mortality and the morbidity of the COVID patients till now. But as Zari said, like so many times, you're pressurized by so many people from outside. And but this is one drug. This is one drug where please don't yield to the pressure of the relatives. And
Kumar, can I comment on this?
yes, Zari, please.
This is one drug where it's easy to avoid pressure by saying that, look, there are many studies and actual data saying your patient may actually get worse because of this drug.
Yes.
As Rahul pointed out, before recovery, that was actually what the data seemed to be suggesting. Now, even recovery, remember, the endpoint was preventing mechanical ventilation, I think, Rahul, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So when your patient is so sick that he's on the ventilator, to consider tocilizumab is pointless. Again, according to me, it's too late. At that stage, it will certainly contribute to sepsis and nothing more.
Yeah.
Because the idea was to give it perfectly timed so it prevented the need for mechanical ventilation, which recovery gave a clear signal that it seems to be doing. The problem with using it early is that it's so difficult to diagnose a cytokine storm. I remember a nice letter in JAMA which showed that if you look at IL-6 levels in sepsis and ARDS of any cause, bacterial infections, fungal infections, you will find equally high or higher levels. Yet this particular molecule, it's a very unreliable test. You do IL-6 from 3 labs, you'll get ranges from 6 to 70 or 700 sometimes.
700.
So how do you make this diagnosis? How do you distinguish a cytokine storm from viremia? Again, it's an extremely overused drug and the risk of sepsis is real.
In fact, we can just safely say that this drug just is not to be given at a single person's opinion, because here we are 6 of us. There is you, Zarir, you are there in the 3 premier hospitals in the city. Rahul is there in Fortis. Samir is there in Global. Salil is there in Nanavati. And we 6 might have to sit on a patient and probably ponder over for an hour before giving a patient tocilizumab. So don't be so quick. Like, okay, tocilizumab, give. Don't do that. Give it a thought. There is more negative than positive to that.
And if you do use it, Kumar, sorry, only use 400 milligrams, please. Do not use a higher dose, a second dose. And avoid any of the other monoclonal antibody
even if
substitutes.
they're sometimes.
None of the other substitutes. Okay, tocilizumab not available. Let's try this or let's try that. Because there is no data on those drugs.
No data.
And they don't all work the same.
Yeah.
All are different.
You wanted to say something, Rahul?
One comment on IL-6. If I'm speaking to some of our laboratory colleagues, if the person who's collected blood in the vacuum cleaner and he shakes it too much, you will have IL-6 level go up.
It's a very
You're
notoriously
supposed to separate the serum and this thing.
Yeah.
Salil?
Yeah. So the problem is that I think whatever message we are getting out of all this is that one, the timing of all these medications is very, very important. Even if it be steroids, even if it is remdesivir, or a very, very small window for tocilizumab. But definitely for home steroid, there is a strict no. We should not be using steroids at home because it will cause more deleterious effects. Now, Zari, since we were talking of steroids, there is this talk, or there are many studies now which have talked of budesonide, means inhaled corticosteroids, since the systemic side effects are less compared to its beneficial effects. So, inhaled form of corticosteroids. Please enlighten our doctors on that.
So that was a lovely study in Lancet Respiration, which came out a few weeks ago, and which we reviewed. It was called the STOICS study, as you know. The problem is that there were just 70 people in each arm, and they stopped their planned recruitment much earlier because the UK, where the study was done, had the luxury of no more COVID cases. They went through such a good phase, so they had to stop short in their recruitment. So 70 in each arm is not great, number one. Number two, there was no placebo limb. The rest just got standard of care. Their trained respiratory nurses were going to the patient's house and teaching them how to use the inhaler. They were using the Astra, what we get as Symbicort, you get as Budicort there. So again, delivery was perfect because that's the ideal device. They were given 800 micrograms a day, but the results were dramatic. I've always used inhaled steroids just to get rid of the cough, the allergic cough, which any post-viral bronchial hyperreactivity can induce. But here they actually showed, and they claimed in their paper, and this was quite a comment to come in a paper, it actually reduced. I think the difference in hospitalization rates in the group that got the inhaled budesonide was dramatic, though their numbers were very small. And they claim that apart from vaccination, no other drug has been shown to be as effective in preventing hospitalization. A bold claim. If an Indian author had made it, they would have rejected the paper, But they made that claim anyway. And I think you can't go wrong with this drug. Ask your patient to gargle carefully. If it's a video consult, teach him how to use it. Perhaps give him a spacer, which is the best way of delivering. Plain, you don't want the salmeterol, you don't want the anything else, formoterol. You just want inhaled budesonide. And it's something that I've started to use in all my patients on home care. The question is, would you use it just for the cough or use it even otherwise? The study seemed to suggest that it was useful even otherwise. I'm not sure about that. But certainly anyone who's coughing, like most of our patients are, feel free to use this drug.
So I think that's a absolutely perfect explanation and where we should be using. This is one option which we have. And rather, if patients have this dry, irritating cough, they are constantly doing it, doesn't mean that we need to put them on oral steroids. I'm insisting on that because there are a lot of hazards which are being happening because of the steroids, even at home, just because of cough or just because of fever. So please resort to inhaled steroid and please do it through a spacer, because that will ensure whatever effectivity you want to get out of that inhaler, the effectivity will be much enhanced if the technique is correct and the device is correctly used. And not to forget gargling every time, because we are giving 800 micrograms. So we don't want the patient to have dysphonia, hoarseness, oral candidiasis, and so on and so forth, because we are actually not examining the oral cavity of these patients. So please, for whoever are going to be starting using it, please insist on a proper gargling. With that, I think I'm going to talk to Dr. Samir Garde now. Samir, I wanted a few comments from you about the fungal infections, because you were telling me a few days back about Global Hospital having a ENT doctor who is having a specific OPD he started. That is one I want you to tell our audience. And secondly, do we repeat IL-6 levels? Because I have seen patients in the hospitals, IL-6 on day 1, it has come 60. Again, repeat after 4 days, it has come as 80. Again, after 4 days, it has come as 120. Now give tocilizumab, or you need to increase the dose of steroids. So tell us these actual clinical scenarios where are we really justified in monitoring IL-6 levels? CRP, I understand we are doing as an inflammatory marker, but tell us about this. Please tell us.
So to quickly answer your first question, Salil, they started a Mucor OPD almost 4 months back in Global, because this when Dr. Navlakhe, who is a ENT specialist, started receiving a lot of references from Jalgaon, Dhule area. And they have treated almost 40 patients up till now in last 2 months coming from that area. And right now, 12 of them are admitted and 3 of them have undergone a surgery for mucormycosis. Such is the instance. And as the discussion went on some time back, they were given pulses of steroid and 2 and 3 doses of tocilizumab and whatnot. So this, of course, is a new thing, and because of his connect to that area, we are draining a lot of. So they have set up a team of ID specialists, a diabetologist, he himself, Dr. Navlakhe himself, and they are looking after all these patients. So it has become a more morbid condition for patients who just recovered from recovered from one thing and landed up into something else. So this is one part. Second part, I think yesterday I was going through the latest 21st April NIH guidelines about treatment of COVID-19. And as far as tocilizumab is concerned, I was just referring to their IL-6 references. They have literally shot down IL-6. They have said in whatever Dr. Rahul just told about the clinical scenario, which is a very, very small window of somebody presenting within first 3 days of admission, 24 hours of admission into ICU requiring high flow, or PF ratio worsening very quickly, or requiring more than 40-50% FiO2 and or rather 80% FiO2 on HFNC or NIV. So these kind of patients, they have, as if you're reading a solicitor's or a lawyer's document, they have really reduced that window so much that you cannot totally depend only on any kind of marker. It has to be a rigid clinical decision, and provided you have ruled out all those things Dr. Rahul just told, apart from that, the absolute neutrophil count should not be less than 500. The platelet should not be less than 50,000. SGOT-PT should not be more than 5 times of its upper. So they have literally reduced all avenues of you using tocilizumab, frankly speaking. They have not said do not use, but they have put so many conditions for you to use tocilizumab, and IL-6 has been, that was my feeling, has been shot down from their document, and it is only CRP more than 75 with all these clinical conditions is the only. So there is no question of repeating IL-6. I think we should now eliminate IL-6 out of our lives and just stick to clinical criteria, and maybe CRP and the other recommendations as per the NIH and our ICMR guidelines, which Rahul pointed out to.
That IL-6 is the first test asked for by every GP at home for a patient,
Yes.
sadly, with ferritin.
It's part of the whole thing.
Can I just make one point on the treatment of Mucor? Normally, as chest physicians, we know that this is one condition where surgery is mandatory. It's a combination of antifungals and surgery. In a COVID patient background, I would say that surgery should not be an upfront option. And at least we've had good success with isofaconazole. Crescenda, I think, is the commercial name, with the drug alone. And I've seen big fungal cavities on follow-up eventually settle. So it's great to have an option which is oral also and effective, which the patient can go home on. And without surgery, yes, you can think of managing these patients, because everyone wants to avoid surgery, at least for the first 2 or 3 months in a COVID patient.
And that also is because probably they have this bad lung fibrosis that they are just recovering from. So, putting them under general anesthesia for a surgery of this sort also becomes an issue.
Very true.
Yeah.
So it's a Kumar. So it's a very important message, for a lot of doctors who are practicing, that IL-6 levels, trend of IL-6 is not the criteria where we should be just harping on
Escalating the therapy.
and increasing steroids or adding a cytokine storm inhibitor or so kind of a medications. Yeah.
I think your basic CRP and D-dimers are much more important tools.
Yeah. So similarly, in Rahul, the other question which all of us face every single day, it's a day 9, day 10, almost in the middle of the second week of the disease, patient deteriorating, and you are bombarded with the request to give plasma to such patients. What would be your views of convalescent plasma in the second week of the disease in really sick patients? What's your opinion on that?
You're really going to think that you're going to think that I'm an outdated doctor, because since the beginning of March, I've not even used one plasma. Okay, so you would really say that you are a nutcase.
You're a smart doctor, not an outdated doctor.
You're a very smart doctor.
I'm totally with you.
So to talk about plasma, second week waste of time. From what I've heard from my colleagues and from my friends and on the people on the task force who discuss it, there is probably a role between the first 3 to 5 days. But first 3 to 5 days, you talk to a patient who is at home with mild fever and you tell him, I'm going to give you plasma. He will stop referring to you and from the next day.
Yeah,
and he would say that it's a nutcase completely. This doctor has gone out of the wits. So I think
I'd bring that time period down to 48 hours. If your plasma is going to be effective 48 hours.
Yes.
And I think it's really scandalous that celebrities like, who's famous cricketers, at this stage talk of donating their plasma and are setting up actual places where people can come and donate plasma. It's outdated. You have to keep up with the times in this disease.
Yeah.
And we know it doesn't work, period.
Yeah, and we have to know the titers of the antibodies in the plasma, and these plasmas are checked only qualitatively for antibodies. That's not the way plasma is to be administered. So as you rightly say, it's scandalous. So Zarir, in fact, a follow-up question on the same fungal issues which arise out of all these things. A lot of patients who are moderately sick on just a very low flow oxygen and have been on a sizable dose of steroids by the time they land up with you in the hospital. What would be your take on starting them on empirical antifungal agents? We still don't have evidence that they are infected, but they have received large doses of steroids in the private practice before they come to you, and he's on 2, 3, 4 liters of oxygen, moderate disease on the CT scan, no cavitations, no obvious fungals.
We know that no antibacterial can prevent bacterial infections from occurring, and no antifungal drug can prevent fungus from setting in. But there have been a couple of studies using the beta-D-glycan, which I find a useful test to monitor almost serially. So once a week in our critically ill patients with white lungs, it's a test I send off to our Hindujala. Very few labs do it, I believe. And if it is high, it is a good marker of fungal infections, Aspergillus candida, everything except Mucor. Mucor is does not give you a high
Somehow
BDG.
we see more Mucor in COVID for
That's
vague
right.
reasons.
But that's
than
the best you can think of, and maybe the BDG for what it's worth. The beta
But BDG
glycan
does get influenced by the beta-lactam is used, right?
Of course, it's got lots of provisos, but at least have some indication to add
Some indication to that. Yeah.
I have one comment on that. So for the prevention of mucor, what I have started to do is just coming up from our ENT surgeon and our ophthalmologist. We're actually for intubated patients who are quite critically ill. We're just cleaning the nose with a nasal spray now, trying to keep the nasal cavity clear. So just a saline spray we put up and we just suction out and clean.
What
it up.
about betadine?
I don't know whether
0.5%,
they
which has been
talked about betadine as well. I have been thinking about what concentration to use, and there is too much of ambiguity
It's
about it. Whether we should just use
0.5%, but that spray
undiluted-
apparently 0.5 is not available in our country. So
Any evidence that works, Rahul?
I
wish it was as
betadine, I
easy as
don't
that.
know. Saline is just to keep the nasal cavity clean. That's all, nothing else. So I don't know whether it works or not, but that's something which you started in the last 15 days or so.
Yeah, I think, see, this entire discussion is so going to be helpful because from the periphery of even Mumbai for that matter, or the interiors or whatever patients we are seeing, there is a lot of confusion about even using steroids or empiric antifungals. Okay, empiric antifungals. Day one, the patient gets in, there's an antibiotic, there's an antifungal, there's a methylprednisolone, and patients' relatives are actually running helter-skelter because someone has told them that you need to get a plasma. If the plasma is not got, then this patient is not going to survive. So there is a pressure from the patient, pressure from the doctor, pressure from the hospital. Everywhere it's like a area where, just telling them that plasma doesn't help really doesn't strike a chord at that instance. But we need to keep on reiterating this point that plasma, TOSI, steroids.
And I think, Sari, you're right. And I think good guidelines should mention more what we should not be using.
Absolutely.
That's so important, and we don't often have the courage to get off the fence and say it. We did eventually for HCQS, but it was part of the ICMR guidelines for so many months after it was shown to be ineffective. So even with my task force, Rahul is here. Sometimes we argue with people who are more keen to use different drugs or feel that we have to be shown to be doing something. The argument should be that there is nothing which really is effective except good supportive care. And then maybe talk about the one or two drugs which have been shown to be working, and strongly recommend that we not use a negative suggestion is what we need.
It's very important that we do that, or maybe have two guidelines, one for the patients who are home treatment, and second guideline for those who are in the hospital, says that people who are treating patients at home at least don't read those stuff about tocilizumab and get influenced that way.
And again, although we were part of the only favipiravir study, let me be honest, I've stopped using the drug because I know this is not maybe the forum to discuss it because you've perhaps
Samir is smiling. He loves that. He loves that comment coming from you.
But I don't, I mean, in the real life situation, I've not seen it to be particularly helpful. And at least it's better than using multiple antibiotics at home.
Yeah.
But there is not enough data is all I say.
But it's a very
Next Sunday
important.
we are discussing this.
It's a very important statement which you have said, because there's a lot of ambiguity in this. Even when colchicine was coming up in the task force guidelines, there were a lot of queries as to why has the task force taken up colchicine. It has been always there, never in the guidelines, and now it has.
Salil, we'll have to discuss all these drugs because they are going to be discussed next Sunday. Zarir, I have not asked you, but you are going to be here next Sunday as well.
No, I won't be able to, but my wife will
One more meeting with me.
Okay, you're there with us for some time, right, Zarir, today?
10 minutes, I've got to rush.
10 minutes.
No problem.
So we'll take up one question, then come back to you. So Mehul, I wanted, because see, there are a lot of controversies about pharmacotherapy, and one controversy is about the heparin, the anticoagulation duration, rather than anything else, duration, because we know moderate to severe cases, we definitely have been, as the guidelines go, we put them on LMWH, but the duration. Can you tell us something, or there are certain questions about LMWH? Should we start for every patient admitted in COVID, or if yes, then how long should we continue? So Mehul, please tell us more about it.
Yeah, so first thing would be that if a patient is already on some form of anticoagulation for a medical condition before he gets COVID or gets admitted for COVID, we would like to continue that. That's the first thing. If a patient is sick enough to get admitted, say in a hospital setting, in a ward setting, and not critically ill, maybe a prophylactic dose of a heparin or a low molecular weight heparin would be beneficial to the patient. but who are on organ support or are critically ill or on ventilator, probably the therapeutic doses may be of benefit, but we have to keep a watch for bleeding side effects. We have seen a lot of bleeding side effects in our ICU also. As far as the duration is concerned, as for any medical disease or any critically ill disease, like we're talking, we go by clinical science and not by just the, our whims and fancies. Once the patient is stable enough, mobile enough, is not hypoxic, I would not give any heparin to the patient unless there is any other medical indication like an atrial fibrillation or a valve or anything. And when the patient is discharged at home, patient doesn't need anticoagulation. We see a lot of people giving dabigatrans and rivaroxabans at home, and they keep on taking it for 3 months, 4 months. There is no such indication from the COVID point of view. Yes, if the patient is totally bedbound, is hypoxic, and has any other medical indication to give it, then you give it. But at home, I would not. So the duration would be just to the hospitalization period. The patient is mobile. Most of our patients get a 6-minute walk test before they are discharged. Then no need to give anticoagulation at home. But and I'd like to also point out there's a lot of use of antiplatelets as a instead of anticoagulation at home, and it also has no role in COVID as far as I know.
Okay, very. I think that's point to take home from there about it. About the anticoagulation and LMWH, it has a role definitely. But Zarir, before you go or before you leave, there's a pointed question which has come to you from the audience. 2 questions rather. One is, can you predict in the first week itself which patient is going to deteriorate?
Even if I had a huge crystal ball, I couldn't do that. And sadly, I mean, you have scores, you have the News 2 score, for example, but it's so, the one thing we've all learned and we've all been burnt is how unpredictable this disease is. We've got young patients on ventilators. You could have sworn they have got no bad comorbidities, that they're going to do well, and they deteriorate. So it is really, this disease continues to humble you. And you cannot make those guesses. I have shouted at patients when they've come and saying, why did you come in? You didn't need to come in. People who've used Clout. And to my horror, found out that 1 week later, I've made a fool of myself and this patient is now in the ICU on a ventilator. Okay. So you have to treat each COVID case with great respect. You don't have any general rules and it's so hard to prognosticate. I wish it was safe to know which one you could safely treat at home and which one you had to hospitalize, but it's hard to know how they will swing.
Basically, the take home from Zarir's point is that every single patient of COVID, howsoever mild it may be,
when you
temperature and oxygen saturation at rest and on exertion should be done at least 3-4 times in a day to pick up early worsening.
And around day 8 to day 10, of course, is the critical period when things can suddenly swing.
Yes, go swing.
And Rahul, for Rahul and Zarir, one more important question. See, because we are doing online consultations, we get calls. I'm certain you must be getting many calls. But now the situation at some places is so bad that there is no hospital bed available. The patient is worsening. The saturation is going down to 87, 88, but no hospital bed available. The physician or the family physician is being told or requested by the patient that please come home and start some injections for me in the form of steroids, because probably remdesivir we are still not being given, but at least give us IV steroids or at least give us oral steroids. We know the saturation is going down, but no bed available. I know it's a very, very difficult question to answer. There cannot be a fixed answer for that, but this question does come. There are, in fact, a lot of doctors who have put up on my chat box. What has happened is certain hospitals have been telling them that you may come, but you may have to get the oxygen along with you because we don't have oxygen.
That happens in interiors of Maharashtra.
Nursing homes. So is there can we say that in case there is no bed availability, then steroids, if there's a desaturation, you are having a saturation of low 88, 89, should we be?
It's actually an easy question to answer.
Very difficult.
If you really don't have an ICU or a hospital bed and you require oxygen at home or you're hypoxic, please give them steroids. That's the only thing which has worked. But that's not as a final destination or a solution. Give them steroids, still awaiting and hunting actively for a hospital bed. That's what we should do, because we should not delay steroids and then they should not be deprived of steroids. Yes, oral can be started very easily. And if there are ways and means to go and give injectable steroids, probably yes. Might be difficult for a general practitioner also to go home in a PPE kit, put IV cannula and give steroids, but oral steroids certainly can be easily started. If they are hypoxic. And that's the only one indication.
Rahul, should they take anticoagulation also at the same time? Can they start giving subcutaneous Clexane to themselves, or because they are hypoxic, they are moderate cases by definition?
I think anticoagulation is a bit too overrated. Yes, all hospitalized patients should get a DVT dose prophylaxis of Clexane. They can wait for a day. I think a day or so, if they are just waiting for a hospital bed to come up, they can wait. But steroids can be definitely started.
Yes.
That's my opinion. Zarir, I would like to know your
I think
opinion.
it's sad that we even have to discuss issues like this. But I
are
would
the
say that
facts.
whatever you would have done in hospital, yes, you're forced to often do at home. And go ahead and give everything that you would have given in hospital, whether it's steroids or even the LMWH, if you have to.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Salil, you need to summarize this very important point, Salil.
Yeah. So what
If I may be excused, or if you have one more question, I really need to get going.
so you please take whatever 5 minutes you have to please.
No, I would leave that. I would leave that. Salil.
Anything specific you would like to give as a take?
No, nothing. It's been a great discussion with colleagues, and I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot from all of you.
Okay.
Thanks for asking me, and keep up the good work, everyone.
Thank you, Salil.
Yes, thank
Bye,
you.
Salil. Bye.
So I think this take-home message about whatever till now we have discussed is about steroids, the timing, the dosage, the duration, very important. We need to be aware of the side effects and the fungal infections, and oxygen therapy when it is indicated and the patient is going hypoxic. So I think, Kumar, since we are talking of steroids and LMWH and this, you may go ahead with any specific question you need to.
Yeah, because what is going to happen is, we discussed about large doses of steroids, we discussed about tocilizumab, but the poor physician who is working in a suburban nursing home with an ICU, with a COVID ICUs, they are the patients who have received large doses of steroids and other immunosuppressants, and they are coming to you. Say, Vikas, like, these are the patients who are typically moderate cases and have received large doses of steroids, or you have to give them steroids, and sometimes tocilizumab. So many people have received itolizumab at their setups. What are the complications you actually expect out of these guys? What would you monitor, and what has been your experience with terms of complications of all these drugs which patients either have received or we give them, and how have you been able to tackle them, including anticoagulation sometimes? Even that is not free of side effects.
So we all know that we are right now playing along with the drugs who are the massive immunosuppressants right now. High doses of steroids, which already the patients are receiving from either their general physicians or physicians at home itself. Right from day one, many of them have been started since day one onwards. And when they land up in the hospital, already what we are seeing is even the non-diabetic patients are coming up with hyperglycemia. The sugars have shot up somewhere. So we need to control the sugars to a great extent. That's very important for us, and especially the diabetic cases who were been given steroids left, right, and centers, predicting diabetic ketoacidosis in them. And we need to keep this under control very strictly. Second thing is like low molecular heparin. Anticoagulants have already been given to the patients where we need to take care of the bleeding diathesis in mind, where patient may bleed GI, we may have melena. These points to be taken care of, where there would be a sudden drop of hemoglobin maybe. So patient may not die of COVID, but rather have some major complications because of the excessive use of this LMWH sometimes. So that's points need to be taken care of. Thirdly, sir, tocilizumab also being an immunosuppressive agent, we need to take care of the patient overall, especially in diabetic cases. The sugars need to be under control so that the patient don't land up into further diabetic ketoacidosis. So these probably more than doing something good, we may land up doing something harm for the patient.
Yes. So because we have been discussing so many things about fungal infections. So what has been your experience, and how have you dealt with diagnosing or suspecting fungal infections in such patients, and what has been your way to move forward with such patients?
So right now in my practice also, I have seen only one single case of mucormycosis. But since past these 4 days, I've got calls from different physicians for mucormycosis already been diagnosed. And this probably we are seeing quite oftenly now. Probably this would have happened because of the high pulse of the pulse steroids which they are giving, like 125 milligrams a day and so. So we need to take care in the preliminary basis itself before starting steroids. Kindly take care. Do not go with a high dosage of steroids unless required.
Are you seeing these complications only in the higher dosages of steroids or even in the standard dosage of the prescribed steroids?
So till now, I've seen only in the high dosage of steroids, especially in the pulse, that more than 125 milligrams. That's what we have seen.
So if you stick to the basic dosages of steroids, you are less likely to at least encounter this. And these complications by themselves are
low dose of steroids would be indicated somewhere. We have to give it, but if given judiciously and with cautious, definitely you won't land up in those kind of ADRs. We don't expect that sort of ADRs. But if the patient been given directly 125 milligram or say more than that, definitely you are going to expect a mucormycosis or maybe other complications very soon. And these cases are going to rise, sir.
Yes, Sameer,
I have a point to
please
say about this. There are patients who are coming with standard dose of steroids as well, who are getting mucormycosis. Unfortunately, the problem in them is their sugars are not controlled well. So that's another aspect which we need to actually harp upon, that we need to control the sugars at around 140 to 180 milligrams per deciliter, using insulin if required, even in young people who've never had diabetes or who were nowhere near diabetes. But we know that just being a COVID patient, your sugars can be high because of the ACE2 receptors and the pancreatic tissue basically having loads of ACE2 receptors, and of course the steroids. Plus, I think if we dig deeply into their medications, you will find that somewhere down the track, some of these newer agents was also used. So it was not just they were on a normal dose steroid, but there was the batatinib sneaked in or a bevacizumab sneaked in. And I think the culprit actually is these drugs rather than just steroids. So steroid in presence of the immunosuppressants actually is a very, very bad combination to give these people. And mucormycosis just we are seeing now. Who knows 6 months down the track what we are going to see? I have just no idea whether you are going to have a huge flurry of activation of tuberculosis. You might just find that happening in the next 4 to 5 months. I'm really scared about it.
This question for Sameer, Mehul, Rahul, all three of you involved in critical care. Like all these patients who deteriorate and end up intubation, and we know they get opportunistic infection. Would you scope them while they are getting intubated and collect a Lavad samples as that you are aware as to what infections you are dealing with?
So can I answer that first?
Yeah.
Probably, Kumar, not while they are getting intubated, only when they are stabilized on the ventilator. The fact that they are getting intubated is they are very sick. I mean, they are either way on HFNC or BiPAP and now about to collapse, and that's why they're getting, some people are coming in crashed and getting intubated, or some are undergoing an elective intubation, but they're pretty hypoxic and all. So only when maybe 24 to 48 hours down the line, when they're stabilized on the ventilator, and if the need arises, if the endotracheal lavage, the what you call as mini bronchoscopy, mini-ball has not yielded or not possible, then yes, definitely. I mean, there is no contraindication not to scope them, but let them be first stable on ventilator.
Mehul, you wanted to make some comment, Mehul.
Yeah, so I wanted to make comment about what Dr. Rahul Pandit said, at home not to give LMWH. Sir, actually, many patients don't get the luxury of getting beds for 2 days. So in such patients, when they are hypoxic and moderate disease, when we have come to a point that we had to give anticoagulation at home, because there has been instances where patient has not got bed for 2 days, and I can't wait not to give him just because, it is not a complete necessity, but since it's part of the protocol, I have to give in some patients. And as far as this is concerned, critical care, first thing is once intubate, we do a mini one. That is important because already these patients would be on some antibiotic when they are intubated. And I can't wait for a bronchoscopy to happen after the patient is stabilized. The cultures may change. So once intubated, do a mini-ball, once stabilized, and if still spiking and if we still feel there's fungal infection or some other doubt and the beta-glucan has not yielded anything, then definitely a bronch with all precautions necessary.
So what?
One input, just to add to what Rahul just pointed out about, that those Zumab sneaking in, and it's not only steroid as a culprit, and we all know that we treat, and our rheumatologist colleagues also treat so many people with steroids for a number of years. It is not only the figure of fasting and post-lunch blood sugar. We all have to encourage our patients about taking a good high protein diet, unless there is a contraindication like in a kidney disease. The T cell immunity which fights against TB and fungal infection has to be kept intact by good proteinaceous diet. It is not only about the pharmacotherapy or the drugs. We have to educate our patients to focus on that as well.
Yeah. So I think a lot of points have been cleared because there have been questions about, steroids specifically, means home steroids, home anticoagulation. What is the dose of steroids? But I would like Rahul also to tell us, patient is hypoxic, patient's X-ray or X-ray is showing a worsening and we have put him on steroids. Now, what would be the correct time to step down the steroids? And if we are stepping it down, how would we taper it to oral steroids and at discharge? Do we continue the steroids? I'm asking you this question very clearly because now patients who are discharged from different hospitals in different centers, they are coming on doses of prednisolone 20 milligram for 10 days, 10 milligram for 10 days, 5 milligram for 10 days, and so on and so forth. So can you please tell us what should be the plan of action in that situation?
So when they are critically ill, 3 to 5 days of 40 milligrams twice a day is what we give, or 6 milligrams of dexamethasone. Our preference in our hospital has been methylprednisolone. For some reason, we've sort of stuck on with methylprednisolone, but we are not averse to give 6 milligrams of dex if required, which gets converted on day 4 or day 5 if the patient's recovery is very good, maybe a plus or minus 1 day to an oral steroid of 30 milligrams of, that's been our standard again, no matter what the weight of the patient, 30 milligrams of Vicelone, which gets rapidly tapered down every third day. So by the time they're actually out of ICU, they are not on steroids.
Very important.
But I'm seeing it even in my hospital. Those patients who do not come to the ICU and who are discharged from the ward are being sent home on steroids. And when they come to see me on the OPD in the follow-up, it is disturbing. It is disturbing, and for no reason they are being put up on 10 milligram, 30 milligram, 20 milligram, 10 milligram tapering doses for 3 days. I think this can be easily avoided. There has to be a good reason to give steroids. Yes, we also give steroids for patients who may have bad pulmonary fibrosis and they probably require steroid as a little anti-inflammatory dose to be given. But that's with a very good thought process behind that. There is no blanket instruction to just put them on steroids for 3 to 5 days and then send them home. So it's very important that we use it in the acute phase only.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing? So in people who are given long-term steroids, who have been, say, hospitalized, tracheostomies, I've seen a lot of patients who come to us on intubation. Now, since some, we also cater to non-COVID patients or post-COVID patients. If they've been given steroids for a long time, they have been on ventilator for a long time, they do land up with a lot of muscular weakness. Getting them to do physio, getting them to, steroid causing tuberculosis, fungal infections, but what about myopathies? We forget that also. Giving prolonged doses of steroids can also lead to myopathy, which leads to a delayed recovery in these patients.
Yeah.
So, you are absolutely right. Many of them actually have myopathy because many of them are getting steroids. Along with that, they are on high doses of sedatives and they are on muscle relaxants. There's a huge amount of myopathy. Proximal myopathy is there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So this was a very important point to be conveyed to the people because there are issues which are occurring because of steroids. Either in the hospital we are giving long doses, high dose at some point, or they may be even going on for weeks together post discharge. So please remember, we are giving it only for that short duration. Just 2 points I will make that when physicians are doing home treatment, along with their CBC and CRP, please send one HbA1c, glycosylated hemoglobin, even at the baseline, because that will really help you to understand the patient's sugar level status. Because there could be some patients who have not checked their sugars for 1 year since last 1 year, and then we never know what is their basal level. One more point is that patients on steroids, I think everyone will agree, and if they are spiking, also rule out a urinary infection, because many of them are getting infection in the urine. There is a urinary infection which is not diagnosed or never evaluated because the focus is on the lungs and fever, lungs, and we treat it with antibiotics or change in antibiotics. So please consider doing a urine routine that may actually guide you in managing the fever and the management of fever. So I think, Kumar, you can take up some questions and then...
There is one question which is very interesting and I've had a personal experience. If somebody wants to take up the use of nebulized methylene blue in severely hypoxic patients. There is some data, very conflicting, small data, but if anybody would like to comment on that, I'll be happy to hear, and then I'll probably give my comments on that.
I have not used nebulized, but many a times I get a request to put them on IV. So IV methylene blue intensive care we've been using for a long time, on and off for septic, for a shock, essentially for a treatment of shock, not for the nebulization for improving hypoxia. And again, there are 2-3 papers which have come out in critical care medicine 2-3 years ago, which actually support the use of that. But all of these are black magic drugs, Kumar. They are not really frontline drugs.
You put it very rightly.
These are all black magic drugs. I don't know what's the use of these steroids.
So the only thing I have noticed is a transient improvement in the saturations by using nebulized. Maybe gives me an hour or two before I can do something more concrete, but expecting that to make the patient turn around in its clinical course is expecting too much. And I know places where methylene blue is kind of used as a panacea, like bad patient, use methylene blue. If one dose doesn't affect, give the second. No, it doesn't work. So just as a nebulized, there have been some reports, but there is no strong data to recommend a routine use of nebulized or IV methylene blue to date. If somebody else has any comment on that, I'll be happy to hear.
No, what
Yes,
you
Amit.
said is absolutely right. Totally agreed with Rahul also. Just one funny input that yesterday on WhatsApp, I saw that in a flow meter where we put water for oxygen, people have put methylene blue.
So before we,
Black magic.
yeah, so
Rahul's black magic.
yeah, so before we take the the parting messages from our viewers, few issues which have come up on this chat box, I would like to tell that AIMS Patna guidelines. I have not gone through it, but the doctor is saying that the AIMS Patna guidelines is saying we should use steroids in mild COVID for home management. So I don't think we are going to debate about this guideline or that guideline. We're just going by the logic about the mechanism of action of steroids and what is the role of steroids specifically in the inflammation which is associated with COVID. So we are not going to, have
Yeah, and we all have to remember that steroid, if used in the first week, it can delay your viral clearance and increase the length of your disease. And all these drugs we are going to discuss, the oral management, home management, mild, we are going to discuss next week in Controversies in Pharmacotherapy Part 2.
Yeah.
So yes, we are not shying away from any of those questions which have come on the chat box like anticoagulation, D-dimers. No, we're not shying away, but that's a completely different discussion and we'll definitely be taking it up next week.
So with that, I think we will have it. The last word, first starting from Dr. Rahul Pandit. Please give us a take-home message about the facts which we discussed today.
Can you hear me, Salil?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, we can.
My
Loud and
internet
clear.
just dropped off, so I've just logged on from the phone again. Look, I think this has been a very, very interesting discussion with you guys, and it's a learning experience for us as well. But I take the point what Zarir emphasized, that you need to use remdesivir, but do not misuse it in patients who have no symptoms or they have only very mild symptoms who don't need to be actually admitted to the hospital. Despite the fact that we know some of them would still worsen and come to a hospital in a few days' time, but we still need to be a bit judicious and careful about using that. Steroids, absolutely stick on to the steroids in the dose which has been proven to actually help. Giving them in higher dose is only going to add to horrific complications, and we probably haven't uncovered the amount of complications the steroids and the other MABs are going to cause to us in long term. And my fear is that just like we had post H1N1 aspergillus, we may have post-COVID aspergillus or tuberculosis or something else coming. Or mucor is already there, and we have a tsunami of mucor is what I would say now. In terms of the other drugs which we sort of touched upon, the other MABs and other anti-cancer drugs, they're best to be left for them who actually have been the indications for them to be used and not to be mixed up with COVID-19 therapy. Methylene blue and several other drugs like that. My take to my juniors is that they are black magic drugs, and I'm not a black magician. I'm not going to use them. So keep it simple. Use the drugs which have been helpful. If at all you need to use tocilizumab after the recovery data, and if you're able to have a patient with whom you can time it perfectly, by all means do that.
Samir, can you please give your take-home message?
No, so in fact, I want to take one of the Rahul's point, which he said very initially in the talk, that good supportive, you cannot use anything else as a substitute for good supportive care. Early intubation, ventilation in critical patients, and excellent supportive care is all that they need. And stick to your scientific data while using medications to the scientific doses, drugs, durations.
Mehul?
So nothing that I can add. I think everything has been summarized. I mean, use your common sense. When facing a new bowler, you know how to bat. Don't try reverse sweep while Brett Lee is bowling. You know how to bat. Stick to your basics. Good medical care, sound medical knowledge helps when you face a new situation. And that is actually proven to help up till now. Nothing else are actually proven. In the long term, we find this drug is working. The long term, we realize it is not working. So good sound medical, good supportive care helps. Rest of the things, keep a watch on the studies coming up. If the data comes up, use only in those subset of patients.
Vikas, please.
I think just one point, don't use the drugs because they're available. Just use our brains, and timely management, timely usage of drugs with required dosages. Don't give them left, right, center with overdosages. Don't load your patients with all the drugs and leave it on the, that maybe some of the drug will work. I would say no for it. That's it.
Kumar.
And we have already discussed everything, like we have discussed all the drugs, everything over here. So by now you all know which drug to be started when and at what dose and at what precautions to be taken care of.
Kumar, it has been a superb session. So please
Yes.
tell us
So I can only elaborate on Mehul's point that if you're going to reverse sweep Brett Lee, be prepared to break your head. And at this point in time, rather than treating COVIDs, I am taking care of more broken heads around with a lot of complications of steroids and tocilizumab.
Okay. So we have logged more than 1,000 doctors all over, and that's a phenomenal number. So now I'll just quickly go through few queries which are very simple. For all the viewers, I would like to say here that we have done one session on biomarkers, which was just last Sunday. So there are quite a few questions which have come up on biomarkers in COVID. And Zydus, who has been our technical team to organize this, you may get the recording of that particular session. Also, a recording of the CT scan misuse and use, rational use in COVID, which was our first web series. And of course, there is a recording of this as well, which would be available with Zydus. So you can always refer to those. A very important point, I think I should take this up because Dr. Sujata from Latur has said that she has the 80-year-old COVID patient admitted receiving high-dose steroids and suddenly presented with headache and a third nerve palsy. And the suspicion was mucor. And that could be one of the pointers, or maybe, we need to look out for other complications which may occur. And then we may go into think about a systemic complication or a superadded fungal infection. Also, a couple of things about colchicine. There are questions, methylene blue, there is favipiravir. There is many questions about other pharmacotherapies, which we will definitely take up next Sunday. There will be a lot of discussion and a lot of fights and debates on that also. We have covered about D-dimers being 5,500, I think. Even inhaled steroids, there was a question about budesonide and cyclosinide. But I think Zarir had made a very good point about budesonide, the dosage and how to use it and provide it. So in the given time, with all the liberty which we have taken with all the audience today of taking them off for a Sunday morning on COVID discussion, I would like to thank all my panelists today for giving us time, my co-moderator, Dr. Kumar Doshi, and our guests for today, Dr. Rahul Pandit and Dr. Zarir Udwadia, for being here and enlightening us with their experience and the take-home messages. Not to forget, thank you, Zydus, for being always as our technical support. And we'll definitely meet up next Sunday with more information, more take-home messages, and more clarity on the controversies in the pharmacotherapy of COVID-19. So wish you all a very happy, healthy, good Sunday. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Samir, you are mute.
Samir sir, mute.
Thank you, Salil, and thank you, Kumar, for conducting this wonderful session.
Thank you.
We learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.